take over. Thank you. We can see your screen, Peter. We can't hear you.
Yes, thank you very much for the generous introduction. I hope that everyone can see my screen and in the presentation in full screen. Just want to make sure that that's the case.
Yes.
Yes, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for the generous introduction. So over the next 18-20 minutes, I will provide an overview of the body of work we carried out to study cumulative advantage, training and application of open science and RRI in policies, principles and practices within academia. Overall, we ask here how the application of responsible research innovation and open science policies, principles and practices affect researchers and their careers across diverse contexts. This is the result of a very significant collaborative effort, and I feel very privileged for having the opportunity to lead this work package and present this to you today. But a lot of people have contributed here. My talk is divided into 3 tasks, which were sort of the 3 very key bodies of work, and each of these bodies of work then was divided into several research questions. In our first task, we focused on the quantitative analysis of the effects of cumulative advantage in the context of open science and responsible research and innovation in academic practices. In our second task, we examined the uptake of open science and RRI in policy and training at higher educational institutions using a survey methodology. And this was to aid in understanding of current institutional structures for OS and RRI in training and their relation to current levels of adoption across higher educational institutions. In our final task, we explored current practices and attitudes of researchers about institutional practices of reward and recognition in relation to open science and RRI. Effectively, we wanted to understand the way how people perceive what researchers perceive as important and what they perceive as valued in open science and open science practices, and what is the difference between what is valued by institutions and researchers themselves. I will now start with the first task, and I will go a little bit deeper. What I will be doing here is effectively, I can't give you all the results that the project produced because it is a very significant body of work, but I will focus on some of the key results, effectively giving you an overview of some of the key aspects that I consider most important. So in the first task, we conducted a large-scale analysis of the effects of cumulative advantage in open science and RRI. More specifically, we used several large scholarly data sets to conduct 4 original quantitative research studies addressing a range of research questions, which included who produces and who consumes most open access research literature. We wanted to know how is institutional performance related to the application of RRI policies and open access publishing. We wanted to find out whether the uptake of open access publishing changed existing hierarchies within academia. And finally, if so, in which ways across a subset of ON-MERRIT's target United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These included the SDG 2, Zero Hunger, SDG 3 of Good Health, and SDG 13, Climate Action. First, we investigated levels of production and consumption of open access research literature globally. We asked the question of who produces and who consumes open access research literature. And answering this question helps us to sort of identify and gain a better insight into the entities, that is, continents, countries, or institutions that are the driving forces behind the rise of open access. And it helps us to sort of understand who produces and who benefits from open access. So in this approach, we define open access production as a proportion of all research literature produced by an institution that is open access. We also define open access consumption as the proportion of research literature that a particular entity, in this case, in this graph, an institution, cites because we see the sort of, we consider that someone cites the evidence of citing as an evidence of use of open access literature. And then we can effectively measure whether there is and see whether there's a correlation between these two quantities. And indeed, we found a very strong correlation basically between open access consumption and open access production. And this suggests that those who produce open access more tend to also benefit from open access more. And we think that this is a particularly important and interesting result from the perspective of the sort of, who benefits and the cumulative advantage and so forth. We also find a stronger correlation in terms of production and consumption of open access for the higher ranked institutions than for the lower ranked institutes when using institutional ranking data from Times Higher Education World University Rankings. We effectively observed here that the most highly ranked institutes are both greater producers and greater consumers of open access than lower ranked institutions. And this suggests that high performers have a certain level of advantage in adopting and benefiting from open access. Quite surprisingly, we found no correlation between open access production and consumption and gross domestic product per capita. And this is particularly interesting for us because we see that we sort of originally anticipated to see that poorer countries might be bigger or greater beneficiaries of open access. And we didn't find that. And what we see here is basically that it tends to be the sort of it tends to be a game of not country versus country, but much more of how well is a particular institution ranked and how prestigious a particular and well-resourced a particular institution is. We see that even in poorer countries or less developed countries, forgive me the terminology, there are often some highly perceived, highly ranked institutions. So so it's not so much about GDP, and it seems much more about academic prestige. Following this, we look into how is performance or prestige of institutions related to the application of responsible research and innovation principles. And we studied those principles which were sort of embedded in some of the open databases of RRI. And using datasets containing RRI indicators, we found a particularly strong overall correlation between one of the RRI pillars. And this pillar is measure of public engagement with science and RRI policies at the national level, and indicating that policy can indeed drive public engagement. Next, we explored who publishes where, asking whether the uptake of open access publishing changes existing hierarchies within academic publishing, and if so, in what ways. And we carried out this work in the context of the 3 Sustainable Development Goals, which I mentioned at the beginning. That is zero hunger, good health, and climate action. And some of the key findings from this study include that we see that the share of female authorships in research on the Sustainable Development Goals has increased from 19 to 30% in 2006, which is when we started. This is the start date for our data, to something like 27 to 37% in 2019. So we see more women publishing in these 3 or across these 3 SDGs that we studied. We additionally found that the share of female authorships to be higher among open access articles than non-open access articles. And I think this is really interesting. These findings seem particularly interesting, especially given the fact that in previous literature, there is a study of Olejniczak and Wilson from 2020, which found that the female authors tend to publish open access less often than men. So we're effectively here quite openly in contradiction with the with another study, or in contrast with another study. And obviously, we studied on different data sets, so this contradiction is not that we would be rejecting somehow their results, but we have a different data set and we have a different finding here. And finally, we also found a clear hierarchy. More prestigious institutions publish more open access than less prestigious institutions. And this is consistent with the previous study of open access consumption and open access production, which I mentioned on the previous slide. So overall, our task 1 studies highlight that it is the higher ranked, more prosperous and more prestigious institutions that appear best able to adapt to and benefit from the evolving landscape of open access publishing. And these trends hold sort of true over time on the global level and when broken down to individual continents and also within specific subject areas. We find that also well-resourced actors publish more frequently open access, as well as publishing in journals with an average higher APC. I didn't have any graphs for APC, but this is somehow embedded in the study that we carried out. Let me now transition to task 2. In task 2, we conducted 2 studies to understand current training practices for open science and RRI and their relation to levels of adoption of OS RRI practices. In this survey, 167 active researchers participated, and we used them to collect information about their practices and opinions about institutional support. And secondly, we conducted 11 interviews with representatives responsible for training provision at 11 institutions across 3 continents. And this was to identify the support, drivers, and barriers to open science and RRI training and from an institutional point of view. So these are some of the key results. We found that open science and RRI training struggles to address practices beyond open access and research data management. So effectively, open access and research data management are those that are sort of common. They tend to be somehow embedded to a certain degree, maybe not to a sufficient degree, but beyond those, institutions really struggle to address these practices. Our survey revealed that uptake of training is surprisingly low, despite showing that respondents themselves see concrete benefits for their research practices. So this is really interesting, right? You see that people see the benefits, or researchers tend to see the benefits, yet the uptake of the training is fairly low, and this could be due to a range of factors. We also found constraints regarding the availability of trained support staff able to deliver training in these areas. And this is related to support from senior management, who sort of need to deliver the resources and who need to set the priorities that, for the researchers, that they need to come to this training. Most of the trainings which we found are effectively done on a voluntary basis at the moment. And there was an opinion among the respondents of the need for open science and RRI within institutions to sort of prove its value and to show that it presents opportunities rather than sort of merely creating additional burdens. Now I want to present the last part of the study. And so in task 3, we first assessed the extent to which open science and responsible research and innovation are embedded in the promotion processes at research performing institutions. And we did effectively we analyzed then the disparity between what is valued by institutions and what is valued by researchers in the context of promotion processes. Effectively or structurally, our work had 2 parts. In the first part of this task, we carried out a systematic analysis of institutional promotion review and tenure policies. And this was to determine the extent to which these policies at this point in time embed open science and RRI indicators. This was done by effectively analyzing 143 institutional policies across 107 institutions and 7 countries: Austria, Brazil, Germany, India, Portugal, the UK, and the US. And next, we undertook an international survey of active researchers and asked their attitudes towards open science and RRI, as well as their experience with the application of assessment indicators in these promotion review and tenure processes at their own institutions. So effectively, 2 parts. One part is effectively desk research, analysis, systematic analysis of policies, and the second part, a survey. So from the first part, we found that open science and RRI indicators remain rarely used, and measures associated with quantification in promotions or in promotion policies still dominate. And despite sort of 10 years of DORA publishing in highly regarded journals or conferences, as measured by metrics such as GIF, was reported as being somewhat or very important in the vast majority of institutional policies, because we have seen it in many of them. So here you see a graph basically which mentions the proportion, or which indicates the proportion of policies that mention a specific sort of open science or traditional metric science, traditional scientometric sort of aspects, basically, So 72% of these policies mention service to profession. 41% mention patents, many mention citations, many mention journal metrics, and so forth. And this is basically the slide in which I want to sort of show you something which I consider particularly important, and is the result of the survey. And so in this survey, we assess the difference in institutional and personal attitudes towards a range of traditional and open science RRI practices. And so you see in this figure that the practices are listed basically, and you see on the left side, we have basically what is considered very important for the surveyed participants, and on the right side, you see what is very unimportant for the surveyed participants. And we asked these survey participants for two views. One view was a personal view of what they think of how much they value openly sharing research data, for instance, and what they think actually their institution values as per their experience. So the personal views are the blue dots, sorry, the yellow dots, and the perceived institutional view are the blue dots. And we have then created this graph by effectively ordering these aspects based on, by starting, we are starting at the top. We see those where certain things are more important to researchers than to institutions. So there's a very big difference between the perceptions of researchers and institutions. And at the bottom, we have the biggest differences between what is more important to institutions rather than researchers. So what does this show? It shows that we see that the practices associated with quantification are still perceived as most valued by institutions, while some open science and responsible research and innovation practices are clearly more valued by researchers more than by institutions. And yes, so we see, for instance, that it is the generating of funding, that is, it is the publishing a large number of research articles, it is the receiving of awards, it is the publishing in highly regarded journals or conferences that is sort of most valued by institutions, as opposed to what researchers believe should be sort of valued. So what are the key contributions of this? Overall, we found that the well-resourced, highly ranked institutes are more likely to benefit from open access. We found significant training gaps. Institutes are still not training sufficiently in the areas of open science and RRI. And we see that while researchers value sort of practicing open science and RRI, that these practices are actually not yet sufficiently embedded in the institutional reward structures. And we hope that this will now become sort of, that the awareness of this will increase and that we will see a positive change in the future. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available for any questions.
Thanks. Peter, you're not available for questions because we, if everybody could put their questions into the Mentimeter, we'll have the plenary session after we've been through all of the work package presentations and the recommendations. So put your questions in the Mentimeter now, and then Peter will be available to answer them in about an hour or so after we've been through the rest of the content.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. No worries. Next to the stage, I'd like to ask my colleague Angela Fessel, Dr. Angela Fessel. Angela isn't unwell today, but I think, are you there, Angela?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Can you share your screen?
Yes, I try to.
Okay. But
can you see my screen?
Yeah. You'll present, but you won't be at the plenary session, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for making it. So today, Dr. Angela Fessel will talk to us about the work that On-MERRIT has done on the link between innovation and industry. Angela is a senior researcher at No Center here in Graz in Austria, and at the Institute of Interactive Systems and Data Science at Graz University of Technology. So a colleague of mine within the institution. Her research focuses on workplace learning and educational technologies with a focus on reflective learning, on digital transformation and socio-technical design, including co-creation, co-design, participatory design. And as work package and task leader in On-MERRIT, she investigated the uptake of open data and science in industry. Angela, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Tony, for this nice introduction. Today I will go to present you the results of work package 4, which was about the uptake of open science resources in industry. What were the research objectives? So in the end, what we wanted to investigate were the levels of uptake of responsible research and innovation and open science resources in industry and SMEs. And to do so, we pursued 3 ways. We investigated the landscape of research regarding industry and the uptake of science resources by doing a desk literature review. We investigate the readiness of economic actors to exploit fair data resources, and we investigated the open science practices in the European patent literature. Our goal was to derive insights about the information-seeking behavior and the uptake of open science resources in industry. So how, if already open science resources are uptaken, if they are not that relevant, if they're relevant, and how they're used. We identified the drivers and barriers for the uptake. So what are the drivers that foster the uptake, but what are barriers or challenges that hinder the uptake, by conducting an interview study as well as a questionnaire study. And we also give evidence about the use of open access resources in innovation processes, such as in patents. So our first task was to do a literature review to find out what the current state of the art is regarding the uptake of open science resources in literature. So we investigated how industrial actors make use of open science resources, including open access publications and open data, as kind of a requirement or baseline in order to be able as a company or organization to uptake external knowledge like open access publication, open data. Absorptive capacity plays a crucial role. Absorptive capacity is the ability of a firm to recognize the value of new external information, assimilate it, apply it to commercial ends. However, from literature, we also know that SMEs currently struggle in the uptake of the benefits from open data, as they find it challenging to develop the necessary absorptive capacity and corresponding capabilities to recognize the value of open data. And SMEs can only effectively and efficiently use open data if absorptive capabilities are available in the company, respectively amongst the skills of the individual employees. If this is not there, you cannot use open science resources in your company. The method we used here was a kind of a landscape scan on literature, and I will only briefly summarize the findings we had here. Especially regarding the 2 major topics we investigated on the information-seeking behavior and on the uptake of open science resources in industry. So what we found in literature is that there are still challenges out there regarding the seeking of information. These challenges include the explication of information needs, so formulation of correct or find keywords, finding relevant information, but also you all know we are working in fast-paced times. So we typically do not have really a lot of time to do some search, and also the accessibility and the quality of content still is an issue. The information seeking behavior also strongly depends on the project stage, the work-related task, and the cognitive need. And if you look at information sources used and compare it between elder literature and newer publications, in newer publications, as you can imagine, it's not very fancy, the internet and digital information clouds are the most sources of information. In older publications, non-digital artifacts such as libraries, regular journals, conferences were the most relevant information sources. But independent of when the publication was posted, personal and social contexts are of crucial relevance to find information or information sources. Regarding the uptake of open science resources in industry, our literature review showed evidence that there's limited relevance of scientific outputs for innovation process in some sectors. There exist barriers as well as drivers already in literature for the use of open science resources, like lack of information seeking skills amongst employees, and companies can incorporate scientific knowledge, for example, through the consumption of outputs, by hiring graduates, I will come to this later, and by directly collaborating with academia. And what we also could show is that not many studies focus on the use of open science resources, and far fewer offer empirical data on the subject so far. Yeah, now based on the literature we conducted, the literature we found, we conducted an interview study and a questionnaire study with the goal to investigate how do industrial actors make use of open science resources, including open access publications and open data. So our interview study was a kind of study we did in Austria to get a kind of a feeling or a first impression what the status with regard to the uptake of open science in this regard is. So we did an interview study with 13 participants. All of them have at least a master's degree and 4 of them had a PhD from 11 companies. 5 of these companies were located in the health domain, 2 in the agricultural domain, and 4 in the climate sector. The interview guidelines consisted of questions such as data, information usage at work, the information seeking behavior, open science access and data absorptive capacity and business models. And based on the interview study, the questions we put there, as well as the answers we received, we then developed a questionnaire that was sent out across Europe, or at least we tried it to. We had altogether 103 complete answers. 10 answers we received via snowball sampling, meaning that we asked our interview partners to distribute our questionnaire, but also company partners we know, and so on and so forth. Due to COVID, this was really, really difficult. So we decided to use Prolific, a platform where you can pay people for answering a questionnaire. And here we could see, for example, that only 30% of these 103 people had a bachelor's degree, 27% a master's degree, and 9 a PhD, and all others did not have not graduated from university. The questionnaire was built up with questions from the company and working context, information search behavior, understanding and uptake of open science, indicators, business models, and knowledge risks. We got a lot of results. I will not be able to present all of them here today because that would go beyond my time slot I have. So I will foster especially on the drivers for the uptake of open science resources, as well as the barriers for the uptake of open science resources. Altogether, summing up, we could have found 5 different good or interesting drivers for the uptake of open science. The first one is about the employment of people with a university education. So for our 2 studies, and also in line with the literature I presented before, the uptake of open science is strongly dependent on the employee's education level. As I said in the interviews, all my interview partners had graduated from university. They were already aware of open science and highlighted also the value of it. With regard to the uptake of open science resources, we could show that open data, open access, but also open source code already played or plays an important role in the respective companies. Open data, for example, they use climate data or location data via OpenStreetMap, as well as economic data that they use for the development of services or products. Open source code was mentioned, but this depends on the licenses. It is regularly used by some of the interviews for further developing the applications, products, services, and domain-specific literature is really of crucial relevance for all of my interviews partners in order to stay up to date in the corresponding domain and to keep informed about the progress of the competitors and the development. So therefore, to benefit from open science resources, companies are currently hiring people with a university degree, thus with a bachelor degree or higher, so that they can really make use of open sources available out there. A second driver were incentives and support. So for example, from the interviews, we could show that companies that already embrace open science activities allow their employees to investigate a significant amount of time in open science activities, like, for example, a literature review, a literature scan, updating open science source code, and in some cases, they have developed specific procedures for conducting such activities. On the other hand, in the questionnaire study, we found out that such incentives or support which are given to the employees when using open science resources or conducting open science activities would be appreciated. And most of the respondents said that they would really appreciate such support. Yeah, also training activities in this regard could play a crucial role. So this training could, on the one hand, close the possible gaps between academia and companies, but also between companies and the public. These trainings could show the potential of working with open science resources, introductions how to use them, and to show them already existing possibilities and opportunities. Additionally, they lower also the fear of using such a new movement, and to strengthen the self-confidence of employees. Yeah, as fourth driver, we found trans and interdisciplinary cooperations. If you think about EU projects, for example, learning from others, for example, especially when working together in projects or towards the same goal, strongly impacts the uptake of open science resources. If you see how others use it, it could really impact the uptake. And finally, the exploitation of the wisdom of the crowd. This refers especially to the uptake of open source code, because the wisdom of the crowd could help to more quickly develop applications or services by SMEs. When having a bug, for example, within an algorithm, the cloud is there and could typically very quickly solve this problem. The maintenance of the open source code is given per se, and the code is continuously further developed. And also this sounds really, really very good. We also found some barriers hindering the uptake of open science. First of all, so I clustered the barriers according to the type of open science resources. So starting with open data, from the interview partners, especially from the interview partners from health domain, one major obstacle is that health-related open data is scarce. On the one hand, publishing health-related data anonymously, yes, is a challenge due to the privacy reasons and GDPR, that's clear. On the other hand, trust validation and compliance play a major role in this regard. So publishing health-related open data is a challenge per se. Second, and applicable for all three domains, there exist licenses that hinder the uptake of open data, which make it, for example, uninteresting for SMEs or industries to use open data because the license forbids them to use this data for commercial use. This is definitely in line with the open science endeavors, but maybe sometimes a problem for SMEs or industries. Another barrier is the reliability and validation of data. If data is available on the web for free, who guarantees or ensures that the data is correct? And from the questionnaire as a kind of barrier regarding open data, we found that there's a lack of clear steps to follow. If you are not used or do not know the concept of open science, it's really difficult for people who are not convenient with this topic. They don't know how to begin, they don't know how to proceed, and it is perceived by the majority as a barrier in this regard. Then barriers for open access. With regard to open access, the high fees for publishing open access were mentioned as big barrier from a producer perspective, but having free access to publications was seen as a huge advantage from a consumer perspective, and paywalls and expensive licenses were strongly criticized from some of our interview partners. If you imagine yourself a small company with, I don't know, 4 or 10 people, it's really difficult for them to pay these fees either for publication or, for example, renting or getting a high-level journal. They typically rely on their scientific partners, or especially on partners from universities. They get in contact with them to get, for example, relevant journal articles. The results from the survey, open access plays a less important role for SMEs and industry than open source and open data. However, examine the reasons why this is the case could be of interest for future research projects. And last but not least, the challenges or barriers for open source code. This is a very interesting topic. On the one hand, open source code, having free source available is really cool and interesting. On the other hand, it has a lot of barriers or challenges you have to think about if you, for example, develop a product for your company. So first of all, there are licenses that allow the usage of open source code in general, but for example, not for commercial purposes. This is a barrier for the uptake, but fully in line with the idea of the open science endeavors as a whole. Second, especially for an SME or a startup, one has really to invest time to carefully consider what to share and with the coding community and what not. So really they have to think about what they would give back and what they would keep with them. And finally, the third, if a company uses open source code, one cannot ensure and guarantee the reliability of the code. So which could result in compliance or validation issues with regard to the customers. Imagine that you have a SME that develops a kind of software application in the health setting and you use open source code. You can imagine that this would not work. The third task.
Angela, yes? We have like maybe 3 or 4 more minutes.
Yes, okay, I will speed up, I'm sorry. The third task was an exploratory study. Here we wanted to know to what extent were open access publications cited in patents. And here we extracted and normalized non-patent literature and matched them with big scholarly data comprising open access status information in order to obtain a subset of scientific non-patent references. We identified patents with an NPL through Google Patents. Google Patents is a large structured text corpus of patents, grants, and applications. And because this non-patent literature in Google Patents is only represented as a text or text strings, thus lacking the structured bibliographic metadata, we extracted unique identifiers used by ON-MERRIT, for example, and matched those 2 data sets to find out how the uptake of open access publication is in patents. As a result, I could say that openly available research articles are more likely cited in patents than closed access work. If you look on the right-hand side, this figure presents the yearly open access in scientific non-patent references in comparison to the overall open access distribution in ON-MERRIT. Here we analyzed only journal articles as the most prevalent publication type in ON-MERRIT and in our SNPR example. And as you can see in our figure, the SNPR open access share is larger than the overall across journals, on average journals, and the yearly distribution follows the general trend that increasing proportion of journal articles becomes openly available. And this peak at the end is only, we think this only occurred because only a few percentage of the SNPR open access share was used for this calculation. The second very interesting result is considerable regarding country and subject specific variation. So US and UK patents cited disproportionately more open access work than other countries like, for example, Germany or France. And finally, we could also show that already 4% of references in our sample were already preprints. So summing up, regarding the uptake of open science resources in industry and regarding the patenting citation in patents, we could show there is already to some extent an uptake of open science resources ongoing. Still, it depends on the companies, its leaders, their employees, and their educational background. And we have detected several drivers as well as barriers what fosters or hinders the uptake of open science resources. And if we look at the open access citation in patents, we could show that it's more likely that patents cite open access publication than closed access work. With this, I say thank you to the whole team for doing this great work. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you.
We say thank you to you, Angela. Thanks so much for making yourself available despite not doing so well. So next we move on, and I invite my colleague Bernhard Wieser to the stage. Bernhard, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Could you share your screen while I introduce you? So
yes.
Dr. Bernhard Wieser is Associate Professor in Science and Technology Studies at Graz University of Technology. In his research, he investigates ethical, legal, and social aspects of science, including in genome research and now also in open science. And in ON-MERRIT, he's led the tasks related to investigating the impact of that open science has on the uptake of research by policymakers, which has been one of the most fun tasks within ON-MERRIT for me personally. So please, Bernhard, take it away.
Thank you, Tony. My name is Bernhard. I'm presenting the results of work package 5, which was on policymaking and societal actors. The people that have been contributing to this work is Stefan Reichmann, myself from TU Graz, Antonia Correa, Eloy Rodriguez, Pedro Principe from Uminio, and Nikki Lisa Cole and Tony Rose Helauer from No Center. So how do I, there you go. Goals and questions of the work package. We try to investigate the role of open science, resources, and public participation in policymaking, which is generally speaking the role of open science. Does it make a difference? Does it make the policy process in any way different? And when looking at that, we were specifically trying to understand the Matthew effects related to this whole topic. And if we find some ways to mitigate these effects. If you want to put that into research questions, they are how open science outputs are used in policymaking and which societal actors have influence in public participation and policymaking. This is the structure of the work package, which is also the structure of my presentation. Just very quickly, first one was a literature review on existing literature that addresses the role of open science outputs in the policy domain. Secondly, a survey we have conducted across European policymakers, complemented with interview-based research. And thirdly, a series of workshops in which we have invited practitioners in this science policy interface, people who have experiences with advising policymakers. Results of the literature review. The first result perhaps to mention is that there isn't very much. So we found that the role of open science in the policy domain, in informing policy processes, is under-researched. However, and that is a result that I want to stress here, that in the medical literature specifically, there is quite substantial amount of literature addressing what is called the science policy gap, meaning that the transfer of knowledge from the scientific domain to the policy world is somehow not as ideal or good as it may be or could be. And when looking into that literature, we found the following. The first finding is that researchers and policymakers, they inhabit incompatible worlds, which means that they follow their own logic, their own epistemology. They have their own goals, needs, language, cultures. And that makes this uptake of scientific knowledge in the policy domain more difficult. However, policymakers do indeed seek information that they find timely, relevant, credible, and available. But what is very important here is that they seek this information, they prefer receiving it through personal networks, through people they know, they trust, they've worked with before. And academic literature plays a less significant role compared to personal networks and conversation. So against this backdrop, we can say that the availability of information from the academic publications is of a secondary concern. Policymakers don't like to read, or they don't have the time to read. For them, it's more important if they can talk to someone that they trust. And finally, we found within this literature a few authors who had some critical observations about the whole issue of science policy gap and how to overcome that and so on. And these people, such as Paul Kearney, for instance, have argued that much of this literature is actually holding rather naive assumptions about the policy process itself. So what does that mean? In short, it means that behind the assumption of the science policy gap, there is this assumption of a knowledge transfer from science to policymaking, which could be portrayed as a linear process, as a transfer of information in a linear way. And that understanding was commented or criticized of being perhaps too simplistic and outdated also. So however, if you think that this is the case, the only main problem that you conclude is that all depends on your communication skills, right? So it's limited and related to the way how you see the problem. And that was influential for how we continued our work. Second task was the survey and the follow-up interviews. The objective was to study information-seeking behavior amongst European policymakers, and then we have done a interview-based case study, which was in Portugal. Methodology: we've used an online survey with members from all European countries, member states, members of parliaments, ministries, secretaries of state, and so on, including the UK. And the national use case in Portugal was targeting the same audience, the same group of people, members of parliament, government. Here we have done some interviews with a qualitative analysis. Okay, results. First of all, overall, you can say that the reception of open science is rather positive. So most policy makers that we have interviewed, or they have responded to our survey, told us that they would see it as a positive contribution to policy making, and they welcome it. Some reservations regarding data literacy or intellectual property rights as potential pitfalls were also mentioned. Second point, science policy interface. Here we can confirm what we have already seen in the literature review, which is that policymakers prefer receiving information through these personal networks rather than reading literature or something like that. And finally, the Portuguese national use case showed some rather interesting results, because they contradict in many ways this assumption of the science policy gap. And our conclusion was that it is largely due to the composition of the Portuguese parliament, which consists of a high proportion of policymakers with academic training. They had careers in academia before they went to policy making, and they're very familiar with scientific literature, practices, and methods, and so on. So this seems to be a specific characteristic of the Portuguese policy domain, which has many policymakers that are familiar with finding, searching, and using scientific information and make them relevant for policy problems, which is, I think, an interesting result, because it speaks to the role of open science. If you have people who are familiar with that, they're more likely to make use of that. Finally, my presentation of the third task, which was this series of workshops, in which we have tried to answer how scientific outputs are used in the policy making again, and especially which societal actors have influence in participation in policy making. Quickly, the methodology: qualitative research, interviews, and group interviews in workshop settings with experienced researchers that work in the science policy interface, so who can speak against the backdrop of their own experiences, how they have been informing policy processes and what they found useful, and so on. So this experience of the people that we try to recruit was a key factor. These workshops were on the same domains that have been introduced before: climate, agriculture, health, and we have also prepared these meetings with ex-ante interviews. Key findings. First one is the importance of the policy goals. If you are answering predefined policy goals, you're much more likely that your work is being used in the policy domain. And that finding really highlights the role of these supranational organizations, such as the UN, the OECD, EU, and others, which are very influential in defining these policy goals. Just think of the SDGs, climate change, and so on. So if you have that defined as a policy goal, it really makes a difference for your own work if you try to answer these policy goals and try to help to achieve these. Second point, cognitive accessibility. This is a point that confirms the literature review, which was already mentioned earlier, of that it is relevant whether this literature is actually meaningful to policymakers. They have the skills, the cognitive skills to understand it. But here we conclude that accessibility, like open access literature, is not enough. And that points to the importance of this oral communication, this personal communication of policymakers with people who can make this literature or this body of knowledge accessible to them. Third point is upstream engagement, and that means that if you succeed in involving researchers, policymakers, relevant stakeholders, practitioners, and so on, in the process from the start, from the beginning, your results of the research process are more likely to being used in the policy domain. So that is upstream engagement. If you design your research, you sit down with policymakers, stakeholders, and talk about the goals, the research questions, the methods, the way in which they are, the research is carried out, and so on and so forth, when it will be disseminated and the rest of it. If you do that from the very beginning, you're much more likely that your work is being recognized and used. Next point is trust and credibility. That has been already explained as an important element of the science policy interface that matters a lot to the policymakers. They prefer talking to people they trust and they find credible. And that is important because that implies a certain Matthew effect. The policy advice system or world is elitist and inaccessible. That's often been mentioned, that once you're in, you're more likely to be asked again. Once you're trusted, once you're established your credibility, that puts you in a much better position that you are part of these policy advice practices in the future. And that can be read as a Matthew effect because it creates these elitist systems, which is fairly inaccessible. So the question now is how to do something about that. What can be done to really make it more accessible? And the respondents of our workshops suggested that the most effective element of doing that is using participatory research methods. And that means, firstly, it suggests the significance of the research design. And secondly, it suggests the importance of the process of knowledge production. So if you have inclusion, participation, open and free access, and broad inclusion of wider groups of society in the process of knowledge production is the best or most effective way to overcome these hard to access elitist systems of the policy advice practices. And for that reason, we have again, which refers back to the upstream engagement story, the importance of the scientific methods. And I conclude with my last point here, the importance of researchers and funders, because those are the people who are in a position to make choices about research design and methods. And I'm sure that my colleague Nikki, Lisa Cole, will come back to that in the recommendations. And with that, I conclude. I just quickly show you where you can find our outputs. They are available on the website. And these are the faces of the people that have been contributing.